right. One of the things about being interested in so many different things, it's really easy to alienate people. I've got about half a dozen things that I've recorded. I know I'm going to see a bunch of people unsubscribe once I publish them. So this is one such episode. It's really unfortunate because I know that there's a certain demographic of people just will never take this stuff seriously. And they're the ones that really need the most to at least just give it a try, you know? And so those of you who heard the last episode, you may have noticed at the end I made some noises about doing another episode with Sam Vaknin as a subject of an astrological reading. And the reason I wanted to do that is because Sam Vaknin likes to use astrology as an example of the kind of bullshit the world would better be without. And, you know, he's entitled to his opinion, of course, but if you're serious about what you're saying, then if someone challenges you to reconsider, you'd hope at least there would be some effort to take a look at the information and see whether there's anything to it. Unfortunately, so far I've been unsuccessful at getting Professor Vaknin to consider this information. So I want to offer it to anyone else who believes that astrology is utter nonsense and get a sense of what might be going on there, that there's something at least of interest here. And I would certainly agree that there's an awful lot of nonsense happening within the astrology world, but I think that Professor Vaknin would agree that there's an awful lot of nonsense happening within the psychology world. So, the question is whether there's anything to it on a fundamental basis. And, I would not have thought there was at one point in my life. It came as quite a surprise to me that there was actually something going on here that was stunning in its power. And it really leads you to see the world through quite different eyes. And I can understand why people are reluctant to do that because, well, it's always quite disturbing to have your frame of reference change radically. But if you just think of it on the most basic level, you have to ask yourself, how could it possibly be the case that life is not in some fundamental way dramatically impacted by every minor change within the configuration of the solar system, which is essentially the meta-system within which we exist? And we are fundamentally a very vulnerable film on the surface of a relatively small planet in the solar system. So we're a fluid medium, in essence, that is just sort of bouncing around, subject to the conditions of the solar system. These ideas, the ideas of astrology, they go back a very long way, and there are many different traditions of astrological systems and different cultures, different utilities of astrology. It's been used not only for the personal horoscope, but to try to get a sense of when is an auspicious moment to do something of great significance, perhaps for people within leadership or what have you. I mean, even recently, I think it was Ronald Reagan who would consult with apparently astrologers. Maybe Nancy Reagan had more to do with it than Ronald, but apparently there was quite a bit of astrology going on in the Reagan White House, which is not to necessarily say that that's something to support the practice, just that it's not as remote and distant as one might think. My sense of it is that, as with most things that have these long traditions, ancient practices, there's an incredible amount of accretion that builds up around it, just as a result of time and variety, all the different ideas. And so it's, a fair amount of effort to separate the wheat from the chaff, if you like. So I ended up making that effort. And I feel like I've come to a relatively concise way of viewing it that at least provides a very clear blueprint for how the system works if it doesn't explain why it works. Now, I think I already explained to some extent why it works, which is just basically this is the meta system within which we're living. Can we explain more specifically why it works? I don't know. Maybe. I'm not going to really try that too much. What I want to do is I'm going to take a look at Professor Vaknin's chart, and I'm going to describe how the system functions, and then I'm going to plug his chart into that system so you can see why I'm saying what I'm saying. So it's going to take a little bit of effort on the part of people to really get the story, but I think it's, relatively easy if you just continue to pay attention and just go for the ride. So I encourage those of you who are rationalists who would normally dismiss this out of hand, just as Professor Vaknin has done, to at least give it a whirl, okay? Here we go. So what are we looking at? What we're looking at is, in essence, a diagram that shows the configuration of the solar system at the moment in question, which could be really any point in time. Now, I don't have the specific time of Professor Vaknin's birth. I only have the day, so this orientation of the chart is not as precise as it could be, but nevertheless, there's plenty to work with here. The chart consists basically of three primary things. You have the signs going around in the outer wheel, you have the various objects in the solar system, and then you have these relationships between the objects. And the way I like to think of this is that the signs are kind of like the setting of the stage. It's the thing within which everything is happening, where the action is taking place. So it's like in a theatrical production, a drama. It's the context. It's the setting. It's all of the stage setup where the characters are then placed. So the characters appear on the stage, that's the different objects, right? And they have a variety of different relationships with each other. And that's, in essence, what we experience inside of ourselves as sort of the different voices inside of us, the different interests and tensions and the dialogue that's happening inside of us. So this is most effective when you do a reading for someone and they're like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I'm experiencing, right? So I don't have the benefit of having my subject here. I'm just going to try to say a few things about what I see happening and see if it resonates with, basically his audience. It would be most interesting to see whether it resonates with him. I will say that I've done hundreds of readings, and it's extremely rare that people think that there's no relationship between what I'm saying and their lives. And usually what I hear is like, yeah, that's true, but isn't that true of everyone? And we could talk about that at some other point. It's one objection that I hear from time to time when I'm trying to convince a rationalist, which doesn't happen that often because you can very rarely get anyone who's really a hardcore rationalist to even discuss this stuff. And that's part of the reason why I'm interested in making this video. I really think that the realm of the unknown has to be considered if you're truly of a scientific mindset. And so one of my big projects in life is to try to find a way of happily integrating a scientific mindset with what you might call a more spiritual or mystical mindset. And I don't think there's any inconsistency. I think fundamentally that we have to acknowledge that the rational scientific mindset can only focus on a limited set of things because most of what's in this universe is something that's outside of our realm of knowledge. And we can only make inference. So here we go. I'm going to talk about the signs. I'm going to talk about this stage upon which the drama is set. This is basically an annual cycle. So that's one of the reasons why I don't like the word astrology. Astrology means the study of stars. This has nothing to do with the stars. One of the objections that rationalists will make against astrology is that the constellations no longer line up with the signs. And the reason for that is that the constellations were just a way of keeping track of where you were within the year. And what the sign really represents is progressions through the year. And the year is, in essence, a microcosm of a life cycle. Indeed, there are plenty of organisms, many plants, for instance, will have a life cycle that is just within a year. And so you can see that there is a kind of developmental process. And I say that what we're talking about here is life potential. And so at the beginning, this is the vernal equinox in the spring, you have Aries, which is something new coming into being. The metaphor that I use is before a seed separates from the plant, it isn't its own thing, it's just part of the plant. But once a seed has separated, it now has its own life potential. So this is the thing coming into being. It doesn't know anything about life. It just shows up and it's carried by the winds. It's sort of like the ejaculate, if you like, that is just swimming around trying to find its egg. And so here is Taurus, which is basically the fertile environment. There needs to be a hospitable environment, or at least a somewhat hospitable environment, that this new thing has to find in order for it to germinate. That's what Gemini is. So Gemini is the germination process. It's the process whereby mitosis occurs. It's where the seed splits, right? Part of it starts to reach up towards the sun. Part of it digs down into the ground. It's split in two, and it's heading in opposite directions, but it's still one thing. That's why Gemini is the twins, and it represents the fundamental charge separation that allows for life to develop. Once germination has happened, Cancer here is about plugging into that environment and starting to gather from it. So you're building the body, and there's this exchange happening. So it's about nurturance, being nurtured and giving. It's give and take. So it's a symbiotic relationship that gets established. You're essentially building the being, which eventually forms a sense of self. That's what Leo is. So Leo is the kind of formation of and primacy of the I am inside of the being, the consciousness that's looking out through that, and it has a recognition of its agency, which allows it to then look into its environment and set it up to its preferences. So that's what Virgo is. Virgo is being able to analyze the situation around you within your environment and to try to set things up the way you want them to be. If you're successful, and it's important to say that at any point along the way in life potential, you could fall off the wheel. It could be done, right? There's plenty of seed that gets spilled that never finds a hospitable environment. And some of the seed that gets into even decent soil never germinates. So getting back to Virgo, if you're able to set things up the way you want them to be so that things are kind of easier, you then have Libra, which is you establish a kind of homeostasis, a balance, an equilibrium, which gives you the space to look beyond yourself, which is what Scorpio is. So it's sort of like in the Maslow hierarchy of needs. You get beyond the basics here, you then establish balance in Libra. Scorpio is the perception of the other. You look beyond your own needs and you start to recognize, oh, look, there are these others out there, and it's not just other human beings, although that's quite often what we're obsessed with, but it can be other in the kind of most metaphysical sense, and there's plenty of others to consider, all the various life forms, right? And perhaps hypothetical others, like kind of this grander sense of the other. And because it's basically through the other that we get to know ourselves. You have to have that mirroring, right? That's, I think, a basic psychological principle. So this is beginning the path of understanding, beginning the path of knowledge is through the perception of the other, Scorpio. And that's why understanding, which is Sagittarius, you're kind of penetrating to the heart of things. Understanding is what is derived. That's what you get from this contemplation of the other and the understanding of the other. A greater understanding of things in general, which leads to Capricorn, which is essentially a greater understanding of what your purpose is, of a purpose that goes beyond just your own concerns, your own selfish concerns. A greater sense of purpose, Capricorn, which then results in a vision of the interplay and interconnectedness of all things, which is what Aquarius is. So the dawning of the age of Aquarius was kind of the realization of all of the moving parts where we're basically all living on this one planet. And so the kind of environmental movement, which started to recognize that we have to take care of things, and that if a butterfly flaps its wings in one place, it's going to cause events to occur elsewhere, that everything is connected. That's kind of the Aquarian sensibility. It's viewing creation, or the cosmos, if you like, as this incredible dance. Regardless of all of its horror and beauty, it's just this interaction of all of these beings and all these forces. And from that point of view, one is able to stand back from one's own existence and to recognize that life is impermanent and that one has to come to terms with the end of your life. And so you walk the spiritual path of selflessness and self-sacrifice, which relinquishes what you had and appreciates that and allows it to go peacefully, so that you make room for the next thing, for the next new beginning, which is, again, Aries. So that is the setting of the stage. This is the life potential that is inherent within all of us, and which we are, in some respects, challenged to fulfill. And now we're going to look at the objects. The objects have a similar kind of narrative to them. So, for instance, I'm just going to do a couple, like the sun, which for Professor Vaknin is here in Taurus, very close to Aries. So when you're near the cusp, there's an influence of the sign that the object is close to but not in. So the sun is the center of the solar system. It is the source of energy for the solar system. And so you could think of it as the organizing principle, and that's basically what it is within our own lives. Here we have a sun in Taurus close to Aries, which means that Professor Vaknin's power, the thing that organizes his life, is fertile ground, a fertile, hospitable environment internally, with a fair degree of new things showing up. And indeed, he does seem to be someone who is able to reinvent himself and who has new things to say even within one particular fertile domain. And obviously, he's worked within a number of fertile domains. He is working within psychology presently, but he's also had some very interesting ideas within physics, and he's been involved in economics and I think business earlier on in life. So clearly he's someone who has a great deal of fertile capacity within him and a lot of novelty within that as well. Because you could have fertile capacity and just stick with one thing, but new things keep happening. So then we have, let's say, the moon. The moon is the object closest to the earth. It's the thing that we feel. It moves the waters, and since life is in essence a extension of the waters, we're mostly made up of water. Women, for instance, their menstrual cycle is tied to the moon. We feel the movement of the moon, and so the placement of the moon is how we feel here in Cancer. So Professor Vaknin's emotional center has to do with whether or not he's getting the nurturing and giving the nurturance to build a place within his fertile environment, to really plug into this the conditions of his life and the fertility that he has within himself. So I'm not going to describe why each object is what it is, but I'll tell you that there's a reason for at least most of these. that I've derived from their traditional meanings. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can go to my website, liberationreadings.com, where I discuss some of these things in more detail. Or you could, of course, always get a reading from me if you want to get into the weeds and see what all this says about your chart. So you can contact me through liberationreadings.com or any of the other ways that are listed. So let's just kind of work our way out from the center. So the thing that is next to the sun is Mercury. Mercury is a representation of the mind. So this suggests that Professor Vaknin has a very spontaneous, a mind with a lot of novelty. New things keep appearing, and that just seems to be obviously the case. We also have Venus here in Aries, which suggests that, and Venus is not just about romantic love, it's about functional relationship, the way in which a relationship really works. And in Professor Vaknin's case, it seems that a new relationship works well. And I don't know if I need to say more about that, but that strikes me as likely true. We have a retrograde, so you'll notice that all of the orange colored objects have an R here on the center, which indicates that they're retrograde, which means at this moment, they appear to be moving opposite to their actual orbital movement from the vantage point of Earth. And so typically, that's interpreted as meaning that there's some difficulty in getting a fix on what's going on in that domain. And so that would suggest that Professor Vaknin has some difficulties when it comes to relationships. We have, this is also, by the way, conjunct with Ceres, which is a representation of the asteroid belt, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later if there's time. Let's move to Mars over here in Cancer. So we've basically been dealing with these three signs. You have Taurus. So Mars has to do with action, the context within which one will be compelled to act. Professor Vaknin is likely to take action when it comes to this, getting what he feels he needs, being able to give something as well. And we'll see that this relates very interestingly with this domain over here. Remember, Scorpio has to do with others. There's a very powerful relationship here between that feeling of the need to act and what's going on here with Neptune. But let's not jump ahead too far. Let's first consider Jupiter here. Jupiter, the second largest mass in the solar system, is a representation of one's experience. So over the course of time, we have what you might call the nurture aspect of our existence, whereas the sun might represent the nature of our existence. Jupiter is the lessons we derive and the sense of what life is about based upon the experiences that we've had. For Professor Vaknin, this happens within the domain of Aquarius, which means that it's this kind of interconnectedness, the sense of all things being connected, a kind of globalist sense. Maybe you could even say, when you get more spiritual about it, a universalist sense of the interconnectivity. And you could say kind of a chaos theory of it. But that vision is kind of what his net result is of the experiences that he's had. We have Saturn very close to the cusp here between Capricorn and Aquarius. It's actually in Capricorn. And so what that suggests, Saturn is like the thing beyond Jupiter. It's the thing beyond our experience. That's why it's considered a challenge traditionally. It is always something outside of our experience. And if we're learning in life, we're going to get a taste of that thing. And so when we finally taste the difficulty that happens from something outside of our experience, of course, it gets folded into our experience. It becomes, in essence, part of Jupiter, if you like. But prior to that, as we're wrestling with it and sort of in the anticipation of, you could say that what's going on here is there's an issue having to do with what Professor Vaknin's sense of his own purpose is, what his real mission is, something that goes beyond his own particular selfish concerns, something that's of a grander design, something of greater purpose. And that issue is something which brings new things into his experience. You might even say that that might be part of the reason why he has gone through so many changes and professional capacities. So then we might take a quick look down here. Uranus. Uranus has to do with a similar type of thing to Capricorn, and why there would be a similar narrative between the progression within the signs and the meaning of the planets and the objects is a matter for another discussion, but it is something that's very interesting. Uranus represents that gift that we were given, the kind of thing inside of us that's going to, in some way or another, influence the world. So in that idea of chaos theory, where the butterfly flapping its wings is having an effect on all of nature, there's a similar way in which we've been given something and it's going to have an effect on the world. And so what's fascinating about this, it's retrograde, right? So it's an area of difficulty, is that it's here in Leo. And of course, Leo is, in essence, the self, right? That kind of I am. And so you could say that this thing that Professor Vaknin has been given, that's really kind of the gift that gets sent out into the world, has to do with the self, which is, in essence, narcissism, right? So that strikes me as a relatively powerful parallel. If we continue our way out, we have Neptune here, which is, interestingly, in the realm of the other. So we're moving out into, and it's worth noting that the outer planets have more to do with generational qualities than they do with individual qualities, which would be very interesting to do. Maybe if people are interested, I'll do this. I'll take a look at how the outer planets have changed and when we might expect the age of narcissism to end and when it began. Right? So here we have Neptune, which is walking away from the karma of this chart. So you're getting to the outer reaches. It's the spiritual path, right? It's the way to get to these final stages of the Piscean, selfless, sacrificial walk to the afterworld. So here it has to do with the other. And it's retrograde. So there's some difficulty here. But the thing that strikes me about this is that in Professor Vaknin's videos, you definitely feel that he's speaking as honestly and forthrightly, and he's giving to the audience. I've heard him mention his books, but I don't feel like he's really trying to sell anyone on anything. I think he's offering his understanding to the world. So this is, in many respects, a spiritual exercise. He is walking a spiritual path within the context of others. And this glyph over here reinforces that concept. It's called Eros, and it's associated with a cherished image. It's not just romantic image. It's not just romantic love. It's basically the thing that you hold most dear. And so there is something about the other that plays that kind of symbolic role in Professor Vaknin's life. They're not very tightly conjunct, so I wouldn't say that they operate as one, but they're in the same domain, right? We then have Pluto, which is a representation of the attainment of enlightenment, you could say, freedom from the karma of this chart, from the drama of the characters within, and all of that internal dialogue. So it's difficult to attain the full freedom, obviously. That's something that we must wonder the extent to which is really possible for a human being to do. But nevertheless, if it were to be done for Professor Vaknin, it would happen within the context of this analytical framework. So remember, Virgo is about organizing and analyzing. It's about being able to see how things are set up, whatever it is you're considering, and to get it in the order that you would want it to be, right? Interestingly, we have here the northern node. which is considered a very significant object in some systems. I think of it as the attractor, the thing towards which you are pulled. And it has a counterpart, which is always opposite to it, called the southern node, which is very much the opposite. It's the thing away from which you are repelled. So you could say that Professor Vaknin is drawn towards this kind of analytical framework and towards the notion of being able to get everything set up the way that he wants it to be. So, for instance, the video that I did commentary on, where he discusses the 20 ideas about how to get ourselves out of this catastrophic mess that the world is in right now, you could say that that's an effort on his part to analyze the situation and to put things into order. And so that is his tendency. That is the thing that he is drawn towards as a mode of operation. This is very interesting here. So the southern node is something that he would want to get away from, and it's happening within the concept of this Piscean thing. So this might explain why he wouldn't have an interest in this sort of astrological mumbo-jumbo, right? It's also right here next to Chiron, which is a very interesting glyph that is actually the name of the software that I'm using is Chiron. I'll give them a little plug. It's a good piece of software for the Macintosh that allows you to do these calculations essentially instantaneously, and it provides a wide range of features. I like it, although it has a couple of problems with it, and they have this new version that I'm not as familiar with, so it's a little confusing to me right now, but it's they considered it so important that they named their software after it. And it represents, without going into details as to why, it represents the wound which through the process of healing becomes a strength. So it's very interesting that these two objects, which are essentially associated with things that happened in the past. So, you want to get away from something in the past, and you're wounded, like the initial wound, you can think of that we're given this sun spirit inside of us. That's kind of like the id. It's just the energy that wells up within us that has this sense of its own direction, of what it's all about. And we all experience some way or another, regardless of what kind of energy we have, we experience a way in which that energy is cut off. Because no matter what kind of hospitable environment or semi-hospitable environment you find yourself in, there are all kinds of other forces at play. And so something cuts you off at some point or another, and you feel that as a fundamental wound. But because you rise to the occasion and you learn how to cope with all the other forces that are, in essence, vying against your internal force, that strengthens you, right? It's sort of like pruning a tree. It makes you stronger. And so that's why the fundamental wound becomes a strength over time. And so the irony here is that while there's a reason why Professor Vaknin would prefer to stay away from the spiritual domain and self-sacrifice, the fact of the matter is that this is a domain where he has a great deal of strength. And very interesting things come out of this. So I think we've looked at almost everything well. There's a couple of other things we could look at really quickly before we start to talk about the relationships, the so-called aspects, which is another terrible word. Just like astrology, I hate the word aspects, but that's what they call it. So fair enough, right? Here we have what's called Lilith. Again, I'm not going to say why, but it's basically a representation of what you might call the Jungian shadow. It is the darkness within us that we try to avoid at all costs, and which, even if we want to see, is something that eludes us because it's always shrouded in darkness. We can develop some familiarity with it, or you could say there's some relative degree to which we can develop familiarity with it. But what strikes me as being interesting here is that this is also taking place within the domain of Leo, which has to do with the self. And so you might say that this is actually the psychopathic tendencies that Professor Vaknin has self-identified in himself. And so we have the narcissism and the psychopathy right here in Leo. And finally, we have Ceres here. I'm just going to say that it's a representation of the pivot between practical matters and rarefied thing. So it's sort of like we all have to juggle the mechanics of day-to-day life, you know. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. But there is a process that happens, particularly with intellectuals and people who are interested in spirituality and philosophy and physics and all that kind of stuff, which is not practical, right? They say things like, well, Albert Einstein couldn't tie his own shoes, which is probably not true, but nevertheless, the basic idea is that a lot of people who spend a lot of time in their heads have difficulty in the practical world. And so there's something to that here. And this suggests that, you know, not only because it's here in Aries, is there kind of a spontaneous, like it might swing from one direction to another. He may be someone that's somewhat like me, where when I get an idea, if I possibly can, I will ignore what I need to do practically and try to spend time on this more rarefied aspect of existence. But for him, this is tied in with relationship with others as well, which is pretty interesting because it's a very tight conjunction here. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about that, partially because I don't want to get too personal in the reading, but also because it's complicated. It would take quite a while for me to get a better sense of exactly what's going on there, if I could at all. But it certainly would be possible to do so, and that's what makes the so-called aspects very interesting. But I will point out a few of the most powerful aspect relationships, just so you can get a sense of just how far this can go. So one of the things that just has to be pointed out is that you have this square relation between Venus and Moon, which you can view like this as well. So here's the Moon, and here is Venus, and it's a very powerful square. Square means stagnation, something that's stuck. So what it means is that emotionally, that feeling of the need for, remember, Cancer is that reciprocation, that symbiosis, the give and take, that emotional need for that stagnates or kind of stops a spontaneous relationship, functional spontaneous relationship, and vice versa. The spontaneous functional relationship is fun, but it doesn't address that emotional need here in Cancer, that emotional need for sustenance, for a deeper sustenance. Let's take another look at a relationship with Venus. Now, this is my favorite aspect. It's called a novile, and my interpretation is that it has to do with the potential for new pathways, for new neural connections to be made. So it's between Venus and Chiron. This is fascinating, right here. So the difficulty in relationship, what do we do to bring something new to this situation? What this chart says is that the strength, the spiritual strength of Chiron. So remember, Chiron is here in Pisces. It's the wound which through a process of healing becomes a strength. That spiritual strength that he doesn't really want to acknowledge as part of his, I think probably because he's so analytical. He doesn't want to admit that there's this spiritual dimension inside of him that's very strong. But that is the part that would bring something new to relationship. That's what's suggested here. It's very interesting. Just a couple of other of these relationships I want to point out. I had mentioned before that that there was something about Mars, so the action that he takes in order to get nurturance, in order to be nurturing. And it has this, it's called a tridecile relationship with Neptune. And Neptune is that spiritual path that he's walking with respect to others. So what he's giving to us, in essence, is his spiritual path. And it's an action that he's taking. He's making all these videos, right? Tridecile is like, it's a harmonious thing as long as you don't overdo it. So within certain bounds, it's a beneficial, harmonious thing. But if you go over that limit, it's not a limitless harmony. You can overdo it, and that will tip things out of balance. And you can see some of the things that happen here when things go a bit out of balance. So for instance, there is a square relationship between Lilith and Neptune. So that darkness, the shadow, psychopathic tendencies inside the self can rise up and stagnate the spiritual path of giving to others. And vice versa, it's the process of this spiritual path of giving to others that prevents that psychopathic tendency from rising up. So by engaging in this process of giving to us, he's keeping the psychopathy at bay. The other thing that's interesting here is another one of those novile relationships. So the sort of the new pathway here with Uranus, and I believe it's novile with, let me check, make sure. I think it's both Neptune and Eros. So we're looking at Uranus here, and yes, so here we have Eros, here we have Neptune. They're both novile, and what that tells us is that this gift that's given, you could say that narcissistic gift, because it's here in Leo. And of course, remember, it's only the malevolent narcissism that's really a problem. So it's not like narcissism is necessarily bad, but it's that gift that brings new things to this domain, that brings new things to that spiritual path to serve others, in essence, and also reinforces the cherished image of the other. It brings new vitality to that image. So that's just, to give you a little sense of the coloration, the detail that one can go into when you look at the relationships between the objects. I hope that I've made as good a case as I can for this. I recognize that a lot of people will never be convinced no matter what you say, but I think it's worth pointing some of this stuff out because it is, I think, a real blindness in people who think of themselves as being reasonable and scientific, that they're unwilling to recognize that there are far greater mysteries in life, and that, if you do enough time with this kind of thing and you become convinced, as I have, that there's really something to it and that the configuration of the solar system really does describe the experience that we're having in our lives, well, then you really have to ask yourself a question as to what exactly is going on in this solar system. And my sense of it is that if it has such a dramatic impact on our personalities, why would we not think that the solar system has an ever-evolving personality itself? That there is some kind of, let's say, soul in the solar system. And of course, we call it a soul. Soul is the sun, right? It's the one. It is the source of the entire system's power and energy, just as it is within us. And so why would it not have a soul? There are even some within the sciences, like Rupert Sheldrake, who have spent some time really probing into the question as to whether or not the sun is conscious. And if that's the case, I think the real problem with the sciences is that they've basically gone the materialist route when it comes to consciousness. It seems to me that consciousness is more fundamental than material. And if I'm not mistaken, there are a number of great scientists in the past who saw it in those terms as well, including Max Planck. There's a number of really interesting quotes, Max Planck saying that he believes consciousness is fundamental. So anyway, I think that will do it for now. I hope that you found this interesting. If you're interested in getting a reading yourself, you can go to liberationreadings.com or contact me. However, there's a number of different ways you can contact me. Taiji at protonmail.com. That works. If you find this interesting, please pass it along to people who will reject it out of hand, because that's what this is designed to do, is to hopefully open the minds of some people who, are quite often very intelligent. I think Sam Vaknin is one of the most intelligent people on the planet right now in many respects. I don't agree with him about everything. I agree with him maybe about 50%, something like that. But I think he's a wonderful commentator with awesome insight, and I'm a fan, even though I think he's wrong about a number of things. And this is one of those things that I think he's wrong about. I wish he would look at it, but I don't think he will. I really doubt it. And that's okay. That's just the way the world is. But I'm trying to correct a defect here in the world of the thinkers. So if you like this and you want to follow other things, you can always go to taijireality.substack.com, or if you want to support, you can go to patreon.com/taijireality, all that fun stuff. And until next time, adios.